Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters. About a month ago, I listened to a speech entitled An Inconvenient Right, about our constitutional right to bear arms and protect ourselves. This is so relevant in the violent world we live in today. During his speech, Philip polled the audience to determine whether we would do whatever it took to protect those that we hold most dear. And I, like most, raised my hand saying that I would. As I thought about effective alternatives to violence that day, I drew a blank. Though gun rights, or gun control for that matter, are quick and convenient answers that don't involve us all that much, they don't address the core issues that underlie violence in our world. As I reflected more deeply on this, I came up with something that I'd like to share with you today. I'll elaborate on a story I heard a while ago that speaks to an inconvenient reality and a difficult responsibility that we all have. The story was told by Jack Kornfield, an American who was one of the first to introduce Buddhist practice in the U.S. A few years ago, Jack was traveling by train from Washington, D.C., and he sat next to an interesting guy who worked with inner city boys who were either at risk or already in prison. He told Jack a story about two people, Tony and Alice. Tony came into the world just like any newborn, full of promise and innocence. But that didn't last too long. You see, Tony was born in an inner city environment full of violence, killings, and drugs. He grew up without any positive role models, and his family wasn't around too much. His was an environment of no hope or opportunity. Faced with this reality as a kid, 14 years old, Tony decided to join a gang. Tony saw that belonging to a gang would give him a sense of power and control. He'd finally feel wanted and maybe loved. He'd have a sense of pride, of contributing to something bigger than himself. He'd also have shelter, guidance, and money. One issue, though, to enter the gang, Tony had to prove himself. You see, the initiation rite for this gang was to shoot somebody. So Tony shot this kid he didn't even know, and the kid ended up dying. Tony was apprehended and brought to trial. Among those in the courtroom was Alice, the mother of the kid Tony shot. Alice sat silently throughout the trial, consumed by deep pain, grief, and a growing anger about losing her only son. At the end of the trial, Tony was convicted. Just before he was taken away in handcuffs, Alice stood up, looked Tony in the eye, and said, "I'm going to kill you," and sat down. After being in a prison for about a year, Alice visits Tony. And he's kind of uncomfortable and a little frightened. She says, "I've just got to talk with you." They have a little bit of an awkward conversation. And at the end, as Alice is leaving, she asks, "Do you need anything? Money, cigarettes?" And leaves him some money. Alice starts to visit Tony. She goes every few months. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, she goes even more often. She starts talking with him, trying to get to know this kid. It makes sense out of why someone would kill her son. When Tony's about to get out at age 17 or 18, she asks, "What are you going to do?" And she says, "I don't know. I got no family. I got nothing." And she says, "Well, I got a friend who owns a little factory. Maybe I can get you a job. So she arranges that with the parole officer, then asks, where are you going to stay? I don't know, I got nobody. And then she says, well, I have a spare room. Why don't you come stay with me? So he comes and stays in the spare room, takes the job. And after about 6 months, she says, I really need to talk with you. Come into the living room, sit down, let's talk. Alice looks at Tony. She says, remember that day in the court when you were convicted of murdering my son for no reason at all to get to your gang? And I stood up and said, I'm going to kill you? Yes, ma'am. I'll never forget that day. And Alice looks back and says, well, I have. You see, I don't want a boy who could kill to still exist in the world. So I set about visiting you, bringing you presents, bringing you things, taking care of you. And now I let you come into my house, got you a job, a place to live. I don't have anybody anymore. You see, my son's gone. He was the only person that was living with me. I said about changing you, and you're not that same person. But I don't have anybody. And I want to know if you'd stay here. I'm in need of a son, and I'd like to adopt you. And he said yes. And she did. Love and forgiveness is not for the faint of heart, but it's something we all need. Acts like this transform us from the small sense of ourselves to something bigger. A capacity to renew, to let go, to live in love. Let me ask you 2 questions about this story, and anybody could respond. Who is the victim in the story? Tony, for sure. Alice's son?
Alice.
Probably.
And
Alice?
Yep.
And I'd say we all were the victims because of an act of violence that existed, that was created in the world. The other question is, who was healed at the end of the story? Anybody?
Tony.
Tony? Alice?
Yeah.
Alice's son, in a way, because his life, his death, now had a purpose. And I'd also say that we were all healed as well by having one less person in the world that could commit that kind of an act. So I'll end with a verse from Buddhist teaching that goes, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. The genuine answer to violence is not whether we control guns or not. It's whether we embrace this attitude and see that we're all participants in the problem. We need to take our own brave and heroic actions of love to heal the root cause of hatred in society so that we're all healed and secure. But this is inconvenient because it requires us to change and become deeply involved. Like Philip, I'm going to ask, who's willing to take whatever actions necessary to protect those they love? So would I still try to protect the ones I love most deeply from immediate harm? Well, yes. But there's more than just reaction in the moment. There's a call for deeper change and action. Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. I wish there were a quicker and easier answer to this. But this simply is the inconvenient reality and our genuine human responsibility in the world. Mr. Toastmaster.